Well, good evening, everyone. My name's Robin Archer, and I'm the director of the Ralph Miliband program here at the London School of Economics. And I'm absolutely delighted to welcome everybody to our special event tonight on the US presidential election and the left. Now, I know many of us, many people around the world indeed, have been glued to our screens watching the results come in. And what we wanted to do tonight, with at least a little bit of time elapsing since those results seem to have become clear, we wanted to consider what the results tell us about the changing bases of voting behaviour and what they mean in particular for the left, both in the United States and beyond. And to do that, I'm very pleased to be able to welcome an excellent panel. We've got two prominent people, a prominent scholar, Professor Jeff Manza, and a prominent activist, Jennifer Epps-Addison. And I'm going to introduce them both briefly. They're going to speak in turn, so I'll just introduce them both now. So Jeff Manza is Professor of Sociology at New York University. He studied at Berkeley, and for a long time his work has been focused on political sociology, inequality, public policy, and the interaction between all those things. And his books are testimony to this. Many of you, or some of you, may have come across his work on social cleavages and political change. He's worked on felon disenfranchisement and its effect on American democracy. And he's also the coordinator of something called the Sociology Project, an innovative textbook, which is a reflection, I think, of the seriousness with which he engages in teaching. He's also got so many articles that it's embarrassing, but I'll just mention a few of them that are relevant tonight. Ethno-nationalism and the rise of Donald Trump, class divisions and political attitudes in the 21st century, and why aren't Americans more angry about rising inequality? Our second speaker is Jennifer Epps-Addison. She's president and also one of the co-directors of the Centre for Global Democracy, a network of, I think, 43 state organisations, all of which are committed to both a pro-worker, a pro-immigrant, and a racial justice agenda. And she studied at the University of Wisconsin, political science. She also studied women's studies and also law. And earlier on worked as an attorney in the public defender's office in the state of Wisconsin. Well, since then, she's had some 2 decades of experience organising for economic and social justice, working with a range of grassroots organisations like the Campaign for $15 and Citizens Action in a number of major cities in the United States. Well, as I say, each of our speakers is going to talk for about 20 minutes, and then I'm going to have a short period where I ask them questions, and then I'll turn it over to you, and we'll have questions and discussion initiated from the floor. Can I just ask you, if you put a question into the Q&A, to preface it by saying who you are and where you're from, either institutionally or geographically or both, because it's helpful to our audience. Well, I know our audience will join me in welcoming both our speakers here tonight. So without further ado, can I turn first to Professor Jeff Manza?
Well, thank you, Robin, for the kind introduction. I, like we all do in higher ed these days, have put together a PowerPoint slide that will cover a set of issues that relate both to this election, but then the larger kind of trends and implications for the American left. Let's see here. This is okay. So just a couple quick comments on some issues related to this particular election. I think without any question, it was a major stress test for American democracy and institutions. It isn't yet resolved. There is a coup attempt ongoing at the moment. The soon-to-be ex-president and some of his allies are contesting the results in a number of states. Election officials around the country have reported no evidence of any kind of fraudulent vote reporting, but nonetheless, this is ongoing, and it is, I think, only reinforcing things that have been going on the last 4 years. And I would just highlight for an international audience in particular but also just to remind everyone of some reasons why Trump's defeat is important, not just for the left, but really for all Americans. So the first big point is that under Trump, the kind of the corruption of democratic political institutions, particularly to the extent to which these institutions rely on norms, not everything is written down, and Trump's willingness to violate certain critical norms, his lying, and in particular, his use of state power to attack his enemies, one of the hallmarks of authoritarian regimes everywhere, has been a particularly salient aspect of this presidency. And had he won another 4 years, the deepening of those tactics, particularly the use of state power to attack his enemies, would have likely accelerated as he figured out how to get his closest allies willing to do his bidding in positions of power. Trump provided a platform for white supremacism and xenophobia in American public life that we have not seen from the White House for probably 100 years. His willingness to amplify conspiratorial ideas and paranoid conspiracies in public life is a third, really, I think, important feature of this presidency. And although it is hard to measure, I think without any question, the spreading of beliefs in various kinds of conspiracies, the so-called QAnon group and others, have become much more powerful presences in American life than they were prior to Trump assuming the presidency. And then finally, Trump has had a major impact on stacking federal courts. He has turned over the appointment of judges to a right-wing legal group known as the Federalist Society, who are promoting ideologically rigid right-wing judges. And this, from the U.S. Supreme Court, the highest court, all the way down to lower federal courts, has had and will have for some time to come a major impact. So Trump is likely gone soon, but I think it's fair to say that Trumpism is probably not dead. One reason that I say this is that the rise of Donald Trump really kind of solved a problem that conservative parties all over the world face, which is how do you compete in democracies when you promote policies that protect the interest of a relatively narrow slice of the population? And what Trump did successfully in a way, excuse me, that no other recent Republican national figures have been able to do is divide the electorate on race and class lines, so that white Americans, particularly working class white Americans, have realigned with the Republican Party to back Donald Trump. And this has, I think, or at least potentially provides a solution to this conservative dilemma. And even after 4 years of his time in the White House, Americans, gave him 71 million votes, which is the largest vote total of any Republican president in history. And certainly, I think Trump's post-election behavior is setting himself up for a 2024 comeback. If he figures out that he can make money by staying in the public sphere, which is, of course, always his number one objective, I think it's quite likely that he will continue to be very active and set himself up for a 2024 comeback when he'll be 78 years old, but seems to be able to and want to continue. But even if Trump isn't a future presidential candidate, it's quite likely that his influence on the Republican Party is likely to continue. The party has, I think, at the grassroots, is dominated by Trump supporters. Trump himself will play an outsized role, even if he chooses not to continue to pursue the presidency in the future. He has 90 million Twitter followers. He generates immense media attention with whatever he does. And especially important is his capacity to intimidate Republican politicians to get them to do his bidding, as we're seeing at this moment during this attempted effort to overturn the results of the election. So one thing we want to kind of ask is there anything we can learn from this 2020 election, and particularly what does it tell us about the future? So I hesitate to push too hard because we really don't have good data available, and the exit polls, because of the unique way in which this election was contested, with very large percentages of people not actually voting on election day, we don't really have, I think, reliable exit poll data to play with, not to mention nationally representative post-election surveys. That said, I think it's safe to say that we now can see very clearly certain ongoing aggregate shifts of alignment on the part of key voting blocs in the United States. So white men and white working class men in particular have been trending towards the Republican Party, but decisively so in the Trump era, both in 2016 and then again in 2020. Joe Biden may have cut into Trump's advantage among working class white men to some small degree, and that may have helped him get over the top in the critical states in the industrial Midwest of the United States. But this is a very important long-term trend. I'm going to say more about it in a minute. It's very striking that the poorest regions, the poorest counties in the United States outside of large cities, all have supported Trump. The 25 poorest counties in the United States, and then a further trend which has been widely commented on and appears to have, if anything, accelerated in this election, is the move of college-educated people into the Democratic Party, creating a kind of classic two lefts scenario. The upshot of both of these is a kind of class inversion in the social bases of the Democratic and Republican parties, where you have increasingly a Republican Party in the Trump era able to be electorally competitive by appealing to white working class voters, and a Democratic Party that is increasingly drawing both votes as well as money and organization from college-educated, relatively privileged sectors of the electorate. And this is something that I think unquestionably has vitally important implications for the future of the left. And I'm going to kind of talk a little bit more about that in a bit, but it's an important backdrop to kind of what has been happening over the last 4 decades, but in particular accelerating in the Trump era. So just a brief comment about the voting behavior of women and people of color. As we all know, both women and people of color have been strongly in Democratic alignment since the Reagan era. In the case of people of color, well before that. I have pushed for a good deal of time the idea that significant demographic and social groups can become locked into a kind of political alignment at a particular critical turning point in history. And so some classical examples in the United States, the alignment of Jews with the Democratic Party during the New Deal, and the overwhelming alignment of African Americans with the Democratic Party from the 1960s onward, are two classical examples. A post-1980 alignment example is the heavy move of evangelical Christians to the Republican Party. They have probably given about 80% of their votes to Donald Trump, which was a puzzle for us in 2016, thinking about a very secular guy who seemingly violates at every turn principles of evangelical Christianity, but nonetheless has been their champion and has done remarkably well. Now, I think there is at least some evidence that a lock-in process is well underway for Latino voters and Asians. These groups are not nearly as supportive of the Democratic Party overall as African Americans, but nonetheless, I think we can see And we've seen it now over enough electoral cycles that we can be confident that this will be the future of the Democratic Party. So that when we think about where the votes come from, we're primarily looking at a party that will draw most of its votes from both women and then people of color. And because these groups are growing in size, particularly Latinos and Asians, some have projected the idea that there is an inevitable Democratic Party majority in the future. It's less clear in the case of Latinos, perhaps, than we have sort of thought up till now. It looks like in the exit polls, Latinos got about a third of the, Trump received about a third of the Latino vote. The New York Times did a very nice county by county analysis of where votes changed between 2012 and 2016. And the single most striking set of changes are in South Texas and South Florida, which are heavily Latino areas that provided significantly less support for Biden and Democratic candidates across the board than was expected. And this is something that is going to require further analysis. But I think the big point is that there is an ongoing debate about the political alignment of Latinos. But I think the general idea of a kind of a lock-in process whereby this kind of group identity pushes members of these groups towards the Democrats is entirely possible. So I just wanted to, okay, so I'll stop there in terms of what I want to say about this particular election, and use the rest of my time to kind of extend some of this analysis and bring in some new ideas to kind of talk a little bit about the future of the American left, which is after all what Robin has invited us to do. And so I want to start with one thing that is often confused in American public life. We can ask the question, what do we mean by the left in the 21st century? And I think it's important to distinguish between, on the one hand, social democratic policies of the sort that we find in Europe from a broader socialist agenda that some have associated with Bernie Sanders and a growing group of socialist advocates among young Americans. So, I think it's important to note here that things the Europeans take for granted, Americans have yet to receive. We still to this date don't have universal health care. We don't have free or low cost college. We have very limited parental leave and childcare benefits. The minimum wage has not been raised for an extended period of time, and so forth. So there's a lot of sort of low-hanging fruit, public policies that have proved successful in other countries that Americans have yet to enjoy, and that, for the most part, when prompted in surveys, Americans are quite enthusiastic in general about getting these kinds of benefits. Where the issue gets trickier is when the idea of having the government, or in particular the federal government, administer these kinds of policies. But in general, there certainly is a strong market for social democracy. And my interpretation of Bernie Sanders' ability or the success in getting quite close to the Democratic nomination in 2020 and running very strongly against Hillary Clinton against overwhelming odds in 2016 is really his advocacy of core social democratic policies, and his continual pointing to Europe and European countries to make the point that America can have a national health plan, we can have improved social benefits across the board, and so forth. This is where, now, Sanders self-styles himself a democratic socialist, or a socialist, not a social democrat. But where and when he got traction, I think, is largely broad-based support was really in his role as a kind of social democrat. And In addition to saying that both these policies are quite popular and that there is a political market for them in the future, I want to make the point, which really the sociologist Lane Kenworthy has promoted in has developed in his work, is that we're really kind of slowly creeping towards social democracy without fully acknowledging, or at least without fully understanding it. So if we look at social policies that have expanded since the Reagan era, we have both a broad set of expansions of transfer programs, that is income transfer programs, and I've listed a bunch on the slide, as well as opportunity programs, programs designed, welfare state style programs designed to give everybody an opportunity to succeed in life. And I would include under this umbrella a wide range of anti-discrimination policies that have, and rights extensions. The point here is that we have actually seen social democratic policies emerging. They're often half-hearted, and if we're moving towards social democracy, it is sort of like a snail, maybe a snail with arthritis. But the pace at which this is happening is not trivial. And the one exception is the repeal of the main welfare program that provided benefits to low-income families with children, but spending on related programs actually increased. And that is, I think, the one exception here. But otherwise, across a wide range of things, we have been adopting social democratic policies. Okay, so if social democracy has a market, what can we say about the broader kind of picture here of what's been happening in American life in the last 4 decades? So I'm currently writing a book called The Two Inequalities. The basic idea here is that we really want to think about inequality in 2 ways, both in terms of economic outcomes, which we might call redistribution, following the philosopher Nancy Fraser, who first introduced this distinction in the late 90s, versus recognition questions of identity, questions of rights for historically discriminated against groups. And that really there's a major disjuncture in both popular support and momentum on each of these questions. But really, from the standpoint of thinking about the future of the left, I think it's helpful for us to understand that both of these sets of agendas are important, and that simply because the United States has not responded to rising income inequality does not mean that there have not been ways in which inequality reducing policies have gotten traction. It's just they've been on the identity side of the equation. And I would underscore that I think the left project in the 21st century everywhere has to address racism, sexism, identity politics, as well as questions about redistribution. And I would also point to, I think, a really underread and undernoticed contribution to this discussion in a book, a 1986 book called Capitalism and Democracy by Sam Bowles and Herb Gintis, where they make the argument that as rights get expanded to protect various groups, it actually can set powerful limits on capitalism, on markets, on exploitation, in ways that can kind of create the conditions for a kind of a merger between a kind of liberal, a classically 21st century liberalism and socialism. And I think that's kind of the broader agenda of this book project that I'm working on. But when we think about the kind of the basic picture here, I think it's fair to say that the American left is winning on the politics of recognition. That if we look across the board, we will see, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in a second, we'll see broad popular public opinion shifting in the direction of providing more rights, more equality, and even beginning to recognize or support for destigmatizing historically stigmatized groups. On the other hand, when it comes to economic inequality, there has been a very limited, if any, broad-based public response to the era of rising income inequality that we've seen since the 1980s. As I think everybody probably has heard, the top 1% has more than doubled their share of all national income since 1980. And everyone else is either stagnant or seeing declines in their share. And just just in terms of the lack of public response, I'm going to show you one survey item that has been asked repeatedly on a nationally representative survey. The item asks respondents, should government have a responsibility to reduce income inequality? And Americans since the 1970s have been remarkably consistent, with some bouncing around a third of a point on a 7-point scale, have provided a very limited midpoint level support for this item. And there hasn't been any increase since either 1980 or even since 2012. So Occupy Wall Street is on the scene in 2011. There's a marked increase in discussion about inequality, economic inequality, from that point forward. I have data on this that I could show you in the Q&A if anybody's interested. But the red line represents that moment when surveys are being fielded after the significant increase in public discussion, media commentary on inequality. If we decompose the results by income groups, we really don't see any trend. So the top, the black triangles on the top are the bottom third of income households, survey respondents from the bottom third, and then the middle third and the wealthiest third. And again, there's no evidence that households on the bottom, households that we know from other data, are struggling to pay their bills, have experienced high levels of income insecurity, and have not seen wages grow at all since the late 1970s, with a couple of brief exceptions. There is an increased support for this idea of using public policy to address income inequality. And I could show you lots of other items that have a similar kind of trajectory, but this one is, I think, kind of the best available repeated item to demonstrate this. Now, on the other hand, when it comes to recognition, there is, I think, a wide range of support for destigmatization policies and rights expansion. This is certainly, I think, most visibly true in the US and in many parts of Europe as well, supporting LGBT rights, gender equality, and declining support for traditional sources of gender inequality have significantly diminished, and all groups are kind of moving together. Now, in the US case, race is a complicated story. So on some items, on some questions relating to equal opportunity, we've seen broad public support shifting over time in the direction of more equality. On other kinds of items, particularly items that ask people about hidden resentments of racial minorities, or questions about stereotypes, how do you agree or disagree with the set of stereotypes about African Americans and other groups, there has been no change. And so it's a complicated story with respect to race. But overall, it's hard to say that public opinion, even in the Trump era, has moved significantly against support for these broad sets of issues. And in particular, of special note, and I should have gotten the data, but Americans have become more supportive of having immigrants in the country. They've gotten more supportive of the idea that immigrants are good for America. All right, last point. So American politics, as I think probably everybody knows, has become much more divided along partisan lines. That is true, certainly true for partisan elites. Members of the US Senate no longer have lunch together across party lines, and millions of other examples. Voting in Congress has become increasingly ideologically divided by partisanship. So the most liberal Republican is well to the right of the most conservative Democrat for really the first time in American history. that is true. Now, the conventional wisdom is that the way you win elections is by running centrist candidates. You try to appeal to the center. Now, I want to argue that this actually has not been true on the right, and this is a powerful opening for the American left in the future. That is, so Republicans, the Republican Party pushed out moderates, their version of moderates from the late 1970s onward. It happens in several stages, but at each of these stages, centrist moderate Republicans have complained about incoming electoral disasters that have never happened. And there's an important lesson here, and I think the lesson is that party capture by the right, that is, party capture of the Republican Party, has not cost them electoral opportunities to control the government. So why not the left? Why not the same kind of parallel process? So first off, I think it's already beginning to happen. The virtual disappearance of conservative Southern Democrats has shifted the balance of elected Democrats in national politics. Secondly, and I think it's kind of an underlying force, but it's a real one, which is that for the first time since the 1930s, when the largest groups on the left endorsed the New Deal, at least after 1935, including the American Communist Party, pretty much all left forces and movements now are operating, or at least talking about trying to influence policy outcomes through the Democratic Party. There are very few activists anymore investing hopes, time, money, and effort in building third parties. There are some fusion efforts where you can vote for some Democrats and some working family party candidates, but in most cases, there simply isn't the same kind of energy and effort that had been put into building a third party. And I think this is really true among the younger generation, which is both showing increasing signs of attraction to socialist ideals or left social democratic ideals, and has entered the main organization that seeks to influence the Democratic Party from the left, the Democratic Socialists of America, which are at an all-time high in terms of membership and support, and there probably are ways to build. So I think in general, if I want to kind of wrap up here, I would say that there are opportunities that have emerged and are emerging for a left to kind of work through the Democratic Party. And I think there are issues where that left has the potential to both capture the party and also shift public policy. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. I think we'll just move straight on to our second speaker, Jennifer Epps-Addison.
Hi, hello everyone. I'm so sad that I can't see your faces and actually make a real connection to you, but I do come from this beautiful tradition called Black call and response. And if anybody has ever been to a Black church, or maybe you've been to a movie theater where the majority of the audience is Black, you kind of know what I'm talking about. We like to affirm. So if there is anything that I say that is really intriguing or interesting, feel free to just throw some hands, some claps, some love in the Q&A. Let me know that you're listening out there and that there's really somebody I'm talking to. Thank you so much, Dr. Archer and Professor Manza, for being a part of this discussion with me. I think it's really critical, and important, especially because what I'm going to walk through with you in terms of how what our viewpoint is on how this election was won, how Donald Trump and his brand of racist authoritarianism was defeated, is not necessarily what you're going to get from sort of the talking head commentators if you're watching sort of American mainstream news, or you're watching the sort of, establishment Democratic Party on this sort of post-victory tour. And so I want to be really clear about what this election came down to and who is responsible ultimately for defeating Donald Trump. Just, I think, a little bit of context setting for folks. And, Professor Manza, you talked about this so eloquently. The first thing to understand when we're talking about the victory of Joe Biden is we're not talking about a leftist victory per se, right? Or about a victory of a leftist, right? Joe Biden is a sort of the epitome of a neoliberal, right? And part of our network's goal in getting involved in the US presidential elections was not just to defeat authoritarianism or Trumpism, but to also defeat neoliberalism as the sort of key underpinning and source that gave rise and created the space for this brand of authoritarianism to rise in a democracy like the United States. And so what folks have to understand is before Trump, right, white supremacy and racism didn't just begin to impact or be ingrained in US policy when Donald Trump was elected. It is at the very foundation of how many of our systems and institutions within government were developed, whether that's our criminal justice, our criminal legal system, which is really truly an outgrowth of maintaining the power of using Black bodies and other people of color's bodies, poor bodies, as human capital. It grows as an outgrowth of our system of slavery in the United States, in almost a direct correlation to the ending of slavery and the beginning of sort of the early days of the prison industrial complex, in which folks who would have been slaves, you know, sometimes months or years earlier, are now what are called convict lessees, right? Folks who were brought in to the prison industrial complex through things like vagrancy laws, poll taxes, you know, accusations of any white person against them. And then they became, you know, sort of long-term leased labor and capital, which continues today, right? When we think about our healthcare system, it is very much the same thing. It's built on sort of a system of both exclusion and as well as capital, right? The ability to profit off of sort of the most harmful, traumatic parts of people's lives. And so when we're talking about the US and sort of the left, right? The left in the US right now is, you know, people try to define us as radical because we want everybody in the country to have healthcare, for example, right? This is a main point of disagreement between President-elect Biden and myself, right? The idea that whether or not it should be allowed to profit off of people's need for healthcare. You know, so I think that's the first thing to understand is what we saw in this election was a coalition effort, right? A governing coalition of leftists, of centrists, of radicals, of a very small sliver of centrist Republicans who changed their vote. But by and large, what the data shows is that folks who voted one way in 2016 primarily voted that same way in 2020. You know, and so we have, you know, on the left, what we really understood, what we realized sort of post-primary is that we had to make a really sober assessment of our power. And what I think you will see post this election is many sort of factions of the left, right, are going to be coming together to be thinking about sort of how do we build strategic power? Because we watched in the primary Bernie Sanders be defeated largely because President Obama made a call and got two of the contenders to drop out and endorse Joe Biden and basically told the neoliberal wing and the centrist wing of the party that it was time to coalesce around Joe. And this happened right, you know, after South Carolina, right before Super Tuesday. And the left did not do the same thing. Senator Warren stayed in the race. Her and Senator Sanders were engaged in very public sort of disagreements and spats that were, you know, factioning off the left wing forces in the primary. So this is some of the context, right? And I want us to sort of understand that. So when we started our resistance to Donald Trump, it was really important to us, even as new people, right, suburban white women in the Women's March and all of that good stuff, we're coming into this idea of being in resistance to your government, right, and being in resistance to the policies of your government. We wanted to make clear that many of the things that we were talking about predated Donald Trump, and we couldn't have a situation in which we defeat Donald Trump in 2020 and then half the, you know, forces of that electorate go back to sleep and tens of millions of people are still struggling and left, you know, isolated and insecure, that would set us up for something much worse in 2024. So let me tell you what we know about voter turnout. And this is something I'm going to be really proud to say. which is, you know, at the end of the day, when all of the sort of exit polls are analyzed and all of the commentating is done, what will be true is that the youngest and the Blackest cities in this country were the key to defeating Donald Trump. You know, Milwaukee, Philadelphia, Detroit, Atlanta. It is because of Black and Latinx turnout in these communities that we were able to get over the hump to defeat Donald Trump. When people say that the American electorate is more divided than it's ever been, it's so divided, I think it's really important for us to push back. The white American electorate is deeply divided. And in fact, the majority of that electorate voted for Donald Trump, right? And it is deeply divided. And there's a lot to examine there, right? There is a lot to examine as to why such a strong percentage of white Americans in this country chose to support a racist authoritarian. You know, and largely what people have to understand is that by and large, this country actually is not deeply divided, except for white folks, right? People of color voted overwhelmingly for Joe Biden. African Americans voted, women voted 91% for Biden, followed by African American men voting over 80%, followed by the Latinx community at 2/3 of their community, followed by Native Americans and Asian Americans. By and large, you know, folks in those communities supported Joe Biden. And so, you know, I think we have to be really clear in the context of America, because what we are really truly facing is a minority, right? In a deep minority. I think in this election, Donald Trump will have gotten less than, I think, 5 million less votes than Joe Biden. In the previous election, in which Donald Trump was named the victor because of the Electoral College, a vestige of slavery, you know, Hillary Clinton got 3 million more votes in the popular vote than Donald Trump. So this is important to understand. Our strategy at CPD Action, we have a network of grassroots organizations. They, you know, build long-term power in their communities. They're there 365 days a year. Our vision is never just about electing a candidate. Our vision really is about transforming the conditions, the material conditions of people on the ground in the United States, the public policy, so that people have the ability to truly thrive in this country. But we understand that elections are a part of that scenario. And so our network really analyzed what is our best chance, what is the best, most direct path to defeating Donald Trump. And what we realized 2 years ago, and what we have been saying to every one of the campaigns since then, is that we could defeat Donald Trump without getting a single white person to change their vote from 2016 to 2020. That because of the way the electoral system works, that we could focus on 7 states that had at least 3 to 4 times the number of unregistered but eligible Black and brown voters needed to secure an electoral victory. So those states are, you know, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania. Those are considered the blue wall, right? And then Georgia, Florida, Arizona, which are considered sort of the transition, right? The new South. And, you know, we really focused hard our energy on engaging those populations. And we saw that play out on election night as those populations came through in record numbers and literally overnight helped turn the tide of the election. So exit polls show what we already know, that racial justice was one of the most important issues for these voters. Black communities in particular made it a central focus of the campaign. Our nation has been in the midst of racial uprisings all summer. I don't know if you have been seeing that, but sparked by a number of deaths. And you know, we have had ongoing and continuous protests in this country. You know, the very people that Trump sought to victimize and oppress over the past 4 years were the exact same ones that came out in record numbers to defeat him. Now, his base also came out in record numbers. When he told the Proud Boys to stand by, right, in one of the presidential debates, they took heed, and they did, right? They organized, and you know, as Professor Manza said, Trump will have received the largest number of votes of any Republican in history, and any candidate in history, just behind Joe Biden, right? So we understand that he also mobilized his base. The difference is that Trump was mobilizing his base, and in many respects, right, Joe Biden was missing many opportunities to deeply and thoughtfully engage his base. And but for the uniqueness of the fact that the American system not just has political parties, but has grassroots independent organizations that engage in political activity, I think we could have very well lost this election. The folks who were organizing the cities, the big cities that ultimately saved democracy, were by and large not Joe Biden's campaign. It was not his strategy, and his strategy was to invest heavily in trying to win back working class white votes, which abjectly did not work for his campaign. So who ultimately headed to the polls, we know that these communities, Black and Brown communities, especially Indigenous communities, have been sort of the targets of increasing intimidation and voter suppression and disinformation. That was a strong part of President Trump's re-election strategy. And I think it's important to note, one of the things you may be discussing is how did he manage to get more votes in every demographic group, including African Americans, including Latinx folks, including Indigenous communities? How did Trump manage to sort of make gains in those ways? And I think, there are sort of three things behind that. There are, a minority of Black and Latinx religious conservatives that were always with Donald Trump. You have to remember, in 2016, he also got the largest support of Black folks of any Republican candidate since Republicans became the modern version of Republicans. So this is not anything new. You also have a strong number of Black capitalists, and we saw Black capitalists come out towards the end of this election, both with Kanye West running for president as a spoiler candidate in places like Wisconsin, hoping to get on the ballot and hoping to be a spoiler candidate. But we saw a number of other Black capitalists like Lil Wayne and Lil Pump and many of these sort of celebrity Black capitalists who also really, Ice Cube is another, right, who also intervened, right, under the sort of auspice that capitalism, right, the ability to make as much money or extract as much money can be race blind, right? Black people can use it rather than just be used by it. I think by and large, that did help the economic aspect did help President Trump increase his numbers, but again, largely that argument was soundly rejected by most communities of color. And then you have his engagement strategy. And I mentioned that Joe Biden had a weak engagement strategy in these communities. We saw the impact of that, particularly with Latino voters. And you have to remember that during the Obama-Biden administration, the common way to refer to President Obama in the Latino community was the deporter in chief, right? And so Joe Biden came into his relationship with this community already at a deficit because of the Obama immigration policies, and then never really put the effort and energy into solving those. So when people would say, well, Trump puts babies in cages, there would be Latinos in America with lived experience that would say, well, babies were in cages under Obama too, right? And so there was this, which one is really worse kind of thing happening on the ground. So I think that also, so that engagement strategy with Trump putting actual money into both digital engagement and on the ground canvassing did have an impact on Trump being able to increase his support. But ultimately, it was the strength of community organizing that made the difference in this election. Our network alone, and we were just one small piece of the infrastructure, but we had a program that mobilized 7 million voters in those 7 key states that were key to swinging the election, and really focused on a few things. First of all, one of the biggest things that we had to overcome was the fact that we knew, right, there was going to be high turnout, but we also knew that it could not just be, the most elite of any of the racial demographics, right? So, Professor Manza talked about sort of this class inversion, and one of the things we really worried about was a class inversion that sort of was equal across race, right? Because by and large, at least in previous elections, wealthy Black folks vote the same way that struggling and poor Black folks vote, right? And if we had some major sort of class inversion, within any one of those major demographics, we could be in real trouble. So by and large, what we saw is that the class inversion really was a white phenomenon, the African American community, again, yes, there were some gains in the Black capitalist class, but not significant. I think we saw most of those gains, with Latino men. But again, there was not a significant class inversion, meaning working class and poor Latino men did not overwhelmingly support Trump versus wealthier Latino men. We contacted, the other thing we really focused on was men, right? Men of color. And so we contacted specifically 4 million Black and brown men in Florida and Pennsylvania and Michigan, some of the areas where we knew Trump had actual people on the ground knocking doors for his campaign. I think that was a really critical decision that we made halfway through this election, because we're in the middle of COVID, and many people had pulled their field programs out of the field in March. And that meant people who were used to getting 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 knocks on the door and having all of those opportunities to engage with the election, to understand issues, to make sure their registration was good, did not have that level of support. So when you think about the fact that most of our programs had to pull out of the field back in March and really didn't go back into the field until late July, as the uprisings were happening and people were saying, we're in the streets anyway, we've learned enough to be able to keep our folks safe, we understand what PPE we need, folks really didn't go back into the field till late July. And so, I think that is another reason why this election appeared to be closer than it was, because President Trump never pulled his canvassers in those same communities that are not used to seeing Republicans on the ground, right? He never pulled them out, and they got a lot of that contact from those folks before, and more consistently than they got it from us. So let's talk about where we go from here, right? So the thing that we need folks to say loudly and proudly, and there is this discussion, as Professor Manza said, there is this discussion about whether or not we have a coup underway. And what, at this point, we think that it is important to say that the democratic institutions are strong, and that, while we scenario planned for this exact moment, and it is, sort of I'm 38, but it's mind blowing to me, right? That I was literally in the midst of planning whether or not the sitting president would leave office peacefully. I never imagined, as I was going through civics class growing up, that we would be in this kind of a predicament in the United States, but this is what we find ourselves in. And we scenario planned this election. We said, what are the ways that they're going to try to prevent people from voting? Because we know that if all of our people get voted and get those votes counted, we will win. So we scenario planned that, and we defeated them on election day, right? In the run-up in the institutions. And now we're in this phase of making sure that we guard and protect every one of those votes. And so, what we know is that even with the legal challenges that this administration is raising, they may be able to shave off a few votes here, maybe get rid of a few provisional ballots there in Pennsylvania, maybe 30,000 ballots, that arrived in that gray area that the court said, we'll rule later after the election about, right? But ultimately, we did our job well, and we believe that the results of this election will be preserved. And we believe, at least at this point, that despite the Republican blabbering, right, that we are able to hold off a coup. And, I think it's really critically important that we say that, and that people understand clearly that the institutions are working, that there has been no credible allegations of widespread fraud, that, people participated, in record numbers, and we were able to hold that as a democracy, largely because what we saw in foreign elections over the last several years, the rise of authoritarianism was not just a US phenomenon. I think you in the UK obviously, have felt that, but also Hungary, also Brazil, right? Russia. So there is a real, we were feeling a real immense pressure in our elections, the left in particular, right? Even as we didn't have the candidate of our dreams, we sort of understood that a true victory, a victory in the Electoral College for Trump, would not just have impacts on the way that he would govern here in America, but it would add and bolster the rise of authoritarianism globally, which, I think really puts all of our countries at extreme risk. And so we took that really seriously, and it was something that we wanted to focus on. So where do we go from here? Let me just sort of wrap up and end with this, which is, it is clear to us that the left, particularly the Black left, right? I want to be clear about that. There's the U.S. left, there is the Black left in the U.S. And I would put Maurice Mitchell, who is the director of the Working Families Party, which Professor Manza named, as part of the clear leadership of a new generation of Black leftists in the United States, trying to bring about political power in the sort of framework of Huey Newton and Stokely Carmichael and even Malcolm X. But the Black left played a key role. Black women were the decisive role, right, in this election. And so now we move to a Biden-Harris administration that is going to inherit a massive financial crisis, that is going to inherit a situation in which somewhere between 20 and 30 million people are 8 months late on their rent and mortgages, who will have a moratorium be lifted under the Biden administration and have no way to pay back that money. So we're facing a massive eviction crisis. They'll inherit an economy in which somewhere between 50 and 60 million people will be filing unemployment claims. They're inheriting a pandemic in which the health infrastructure in the country is wholly unprepared to deal with the crisis. It's why, despite it's why we've had such terrible outcomes despite the rest of the world being able to make progress and gains. And so the Biden administration will inherit all of this. And I think if they maintain their position, nothing will fundamentally change, status quo, let's go back to normal. We're going to be in a, sort of both in a world of hurt. It will be insufficient, wholly insufficient to turn the tide in our country. It may, be wholly insufficient to be able to prevent mass municipal bankruptcies with our mid to large size cities facing bankruptcy. And ultimately it could create this sort of real, true traumatic conditions, people waiting in food lines, people, losing their homes, people, sort of mass criminalization to deal with drug addiction and the opioid crisis and a whole host of things that will be tangential to that pain. And if we are not able to push Biden's administration to make big, bold, and structural changes, it could set the table for not just a Trump return in 2024, but for a sort of a return bigger, badder, and stronger, and with a much wider bench in terms of being able to influence the institutions of governance. So we are going to really organize to push this administration. The first thing that we're going to do, and I'll end with this, which is, we have, unlike other countries, we have provided nearly no help to Americans during this pandemic. I know, it probably blows your mind, but there's been no guaranteed income here. There's been no maintaining employment roles by paying payroll directly. There's been no opening up of accessibility to healthcare. People are really struggling in this country. And I have watched members, one organization of ours in New York has seen 33 of their members die from COVID. They have turned into a makeshift response unit where they're literally helping people track down bodies because the morgues are so overwhelmed. People can't find their loved ones after they pass away. I've seen lines around the block, right? It's not just like we can't find toilet paper. People can't afford to buy food. And so, we have a real obligation to use this moment, not just to, say, yay, we defeated Trump and acquiesce to neoliberalism. As leftists, we have a huge responsibility to use this moment and to work just as hard under a Biden-Harris administration to build the country of our dreams, to build a country where everybody can thrive, as we have over the last 4 years under Trump's administration, trying to protect ourselves and keep our loved ones alive. That's our responsibility, and I think that's where the US left will go next.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm just going to ask a question to you both, and then I'm going to turn it over to the audience. I'll try and be succinct, and I think maybe we get a few extra questions in that way. So I'll start with you, Professor Manza. I mean, often when people take the long view of American electoral politics, they see long periods of stability punctuated by moments of realignment. And I guess my question to you is, what do all the trends that you've discussed add up to? Do they actually add up to such a moment? Is it a moment of realignment in the way that the 1930s is said to be, or the 1890s is said to be? Or is it a more complicated picture that doesn't really fit with that characterization?
Yeah, it's a really good and important question, and I think my read of kind of where we are is that we are several election cycles away from the potential realignment that comes with true demographic change in the electorate. White Americans will likely be a minority of the population by 2050 or somewhere like in that range. That's partly dependent on whether Latinxes can become white, or how many consider themselves white in the future. But I think we are seeing an ongoing shift that is likely to produce, I think, a pretty dramatic electoral shift in the future, along the lines of what happened in California. I grew up in California, and in my childhood, I'm significantly older than Jennifer. In my childhood, Republicans ran the state. They controlled the state legislature. We had Reagan, we had Pete Wilson, we had, George Dubé, and we had, Republican governors. And now the state is seeing this demographic shift really take hold. The Democratic Party dominates politics. California is also, at the edge of a whole set of interesting policy initiatives that, it's difficult to do everything you might want at the state level in the American system, federal system. But I think, the California outcome here we may be 15 or 20 years away from nationally. The other thing that I would say is that this conservative dilemma that I talked about, how do you win elections when you promote policies that serve the interests of only a few? And, one way you do it is obviously trying to divide people along lines of race or religion. And that, I think, has kind of probably run its course, because this transition is also kind of moving away from the kinds of, people who bought into this kind of politics, right? So, evangelicals are falling as a percentage of the population. We have more seculars, more, religiously liberal people. We have, the shift of older white voters to die, and replaced by younger voters who are much more diverse. And I think that shift but I think we're still a few cycles away. And what Trump was able to do was kind of freeze history by the use of racially charged anti-immigrant rhetoric to kind of increase the white share of the Republican vote. But that can only go so far. And among college-educated whites and among unionized white households, there's a kind of upper limit here on how far it can go. And I think this may be the kind of the top of the cycle for this style of what Jacob Hacker and Paul Pierson call plutocratic populism, at least in a two-party system, which I think is something neither of us really mentioned, but is important for a European audience. The two-party system is part of, the unique aspect of American politics, and part of why, one logical outcome here would be for Trump to split away from the Republican Party and form a third party movement, and be competitive, I think, at least in challenging for dominance on the right. But instead, he kind of goes through the Republican Party, creating this dynamic that I think has succeeded in maintaining their electoral viability in the short run. But in the long run, they've got a big problem. And that's where I think the California outcome is perhaps more likely.
Okay, look, thanks a lot. So Jennifer, I want to pick up on what you were saying in the middle of your comments about organising strategies. And that's obviously something you're very involved in and very invested in. I mean, looking at it from outside, there are a number of states where long-term organising that fed into the election, but was not only about the election, seems to have paid off. Now, from outside, it looks to me like maybe in Georgia, maybe especially in Arizona. But you listed a number of other states, and they were not all states where this electoral payoff was seen. So is there something you can say about what was distinctive about those states, you know, maybe with the mind of people in other countries who would be thinking about this kind of organising effort?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, first, again, you're right. It is my central hypothesis that the depth of long-term organizing and the scale in which it was invested in really directly correlates to how many votes people were able to turn out and ultimately to places that won. But what I would caution is to say, you know, I look at somewhere like Texas or Florida, for example, Georgia, right, and Arizona, Nevada, even to some extent, right? Colorado is another place, right? These are places where, you know, there is a real constant like contention for power. You know, not just sort of the federal electorate, but like really truly on the ground. You know, they are a place where we see the racial divides, the opportunity divides, the wealth divides to be, you know, incredibly pronounced, right? Having some of the most wealthy and some of the poorest, right? You know, having, you know, an incredibly diverse state. So, you know, I think here's what I really truly think. If we would not have had those strong community organizations like New Florida Majority, Organized Florida, Texas Organizing Project, Lucha in Arizona, if we would not have had these strong community organizing groups running the incredible program they would have ran, it would have been much easier for Trump to defeat Biden in the election because he could have focused pretty much all of his energy on the blue wall, right? On where we knew we were all going to compete. Biden telegraphed his strategy. We knew his strategy was Minnesota, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. And so did Trump. And if Trump could have focused all of his energy and intention there, we could have been in real trouble if he could have squeaked out another 6 to 8% of Black votes out of Milwaukee or Detroit. I think we could have been in trouble. And so, you know, I think that the states that came close but didn't get over the hump are equally as much a part of this story as the states that kind of squeaked by. But, you know, let's go to Georgia for a second, because Georgia is going to be really telling. Obviously, you know, I was on the ground for Stacey Abrams' gubernatorial race. I saw it firsthand, the immense amount of voter suppression at the hands of then Secretary of State Kemp, right, who was in charge of administering the election he was running for governor in. I just want people to hear that again. I want you to understand what happened in Georgia, right? The person administering the election was also the candidate, and he got to control the election and count his votes. I just want to, okay, so now we're all there, what happened in Georgia. But, you know, I look at the fact that our affiliate New Georgia Project was started by Stacey Abrams. Stacey Abrams then obviously went on to run for governor and then start Fair Fight. But, you know, it was her analysis that Georgia is homegrown. It has all it needs to have a better, you know, more safer community, everything it needs. But the suppression and the lack of participation from particularly Black voters, but voters of every background, was critical to maintaining Republican rule. And so she set upon the idea to register as many people as possible, particularly Black folks. And so we see that happening, but you can't register people and then not give them a reason to vote, right? They're not hopeful, they don't have an aspiration. And so we had to have conversations, and this is the difference. What New Georgia Project did is they didn't just go say you have to vote, go vote for Biden, Biden's your only choice. They really engaged in this like long-term process of having conversations with people. What are you struggling with? What are your hopes and aspirations? You know, what do you want to see happen in the world? And it gave people this sense that not only would their vote matter, but actually their participation, their voice, their story of struggle, that those types of things matter. And so when people say, can we sustain it? You know, I have to remind people it was never about the election, right? We don't have to, it's been sustained. This is ongoing work. And as we turn our attention back to these two Senate candidates, the thing that I think is really important for the left, but really important for the establishment Democrats, is to not screw it up. right? As soon as the races were called, we had establishment Democrats like Nancy Pelosi, a great Speaker of the House, but maybe shouldn't, be directing people how to organize Georgia. We should leave that to Georgians, right? But we had folks saying, stay away from leftist issues, Black issues like defund the police, that's gonna lose us Georgia. Meanwhile, the candidate that you are running, particularly Reverend Warnock, is the pastor at Ebenezer Baptist Church, Martin Luther King's old church, right? He ran on a social justice platform. He got the most votes in his primary, not by playing to the center, not by downplaying his commitment to healthcare, not by downplaying his commitment to Black Lives Matter, but by leading with that and building a multiracial working class coalition in Georgia capable of defeating the immense amount of voter suppression that the governor and the Secretary of State put in their way. So I think Georgia, if you want to help with Georgia, you can get on calls, right? You can send text messages. We're currently registering 18-year-olds, folks who will be 18 before the election, who are going to be allowed to vote for the first time. We're working closely with New Georgia Project, but the test about whether we win Georgia will be, will establishment Democrats get in the way, pushing a neoliberalism that was not the linchpin for why Atlanta had 128% voter turnout. Oh no, I think Robin might be frozen.
Well, that's a little awkward. We can run our own panel. One thing, Jennifer, I deeply admire.
Okay, listen, thank you very much.
Here we go.
There you are.
I'm just going to urge decision in answers if possible. It's not always possible. Let's try and get a few.
I think there you are. Hi.
Are we back? Hello, hello. Yep. Now we've got to just find out what that question was. So there's a question from Evan Webb, who's an LSE student, and the questioner asks, looking at the election map, there seems to be a huge divide between urban and rural voters. What, if anything, can the Democratic Party do to reach rural voters? I think I'll just direct these to one person so we get through some more questions. So actually, Jeff, would you mind just briefly addressing that?
Yeah, historically, this was not the case from the 30s to the 70s that, the Democratic candidates were very competitive. The creation of a whole set of programs to support farmers, and when farmers were still, only about 2% of the population is engaged in farming or farm labor today. But, that this hasn't always been the case. I have actually been reading and thinking about some of the rural population's aversion to liberalism, the left, the Democratic Party. It's real. People blame the federal government for economic decline in rural areas, which is really hitting some parts of the country. Some rural places are in severe decline where there are no jobs. Hopelessness is extremely high. There's two famous economists just brought out a book called The Deaths of Despair about the rising percentage of middle-aged people in rural communities who are dying of drug overdoses, alcohol overdoses, have a sense of hopelessness and severe mental health issues. So the question is, it's not there's no one answer to the puzzle, but somehow there's a disconnect between the kinds of policy initiatives that the Democratic Party as a whole, and certainly the kind of social democratic left, would like to see, and how those might benefit rural community, and what the understanding of people in those communities really are, and their deep hatred of the federal government at the same time that they do love the fact that there's Medicare when they reach 65, or that they do love that there is, there are unemployment programs that that at least provide, some benefits for some people under some, conditions. I actually think it's a really interesting question also to ask Jennifer, whether, you've thought about this and whether, are there ways that we could find a way to bridge the sort of urban-based people, communities of color with the rural white population, or they're mostly white, about 85% of rural residents are white. And in some ways, there are a lot of overlapping issues that, if there was a way to kind of make that connection and sort of bring people together who share interests, that would be a way of bending the stick the other direction. We talked about class of inversion. I mean, this would be, sort of trying to find ways to reconnect voters who are currently very disadvantaged in a wide variety of ways.
Okay, look, rather than answer that, I'm just going to try and get in another question because, and feel free to sort of tack it on if you want to. So I've got another question here from Tobias Wendell, an LSE alumnus who's calling in from Germany, and asks, and I'll just direct it to you, Jennifer, how can the Democratic Party shift to social democracy before the next right-wing authoritarian is elected, and how in particular can the left overcome deep-rooted beliefs about the links between personal and economic freedom? So I think the questioner is referring to what is often a person in the street's understanding of the commitment to a certain notion of liberalism in the United States, which is deeper than just the neoliberalism you're talking about.
Yeah, well, that's the million-dollar question right there. I mean, I'm working on it. Look, first and foremost, like, Americans have to deal with race. It is, the level of racial animosity and the sort of fundamental foundation of white supremacy in this country is unsustainable as a practice, right? A minority of ideological, viewpoints ruling over the rest of us is an unsustainable way to practice democracy. And so we in the coming years are going to have to come to terms with this. We're going to have a conversation about the Electoral College as a vestige of slavery and maintaining the power, right? We're going to have to grapple with the fact that we consider one vote in Wyoming more important than 4 million in California, right? And that vote in Wyoming is 93 or 8% likely to be a white person, where the vote in California is 60-something% likely to be a person of color, right? We have to grapple with this as a country. And so whoever, right, wants to hope to sort of save off the ability to divide and conquer and pick folks off and break apart the sort of governing coalition that Joe Biden was able to form is going to try to prevent us from dealing with that, right? It's going to be to their benefit if we don't. So I think that's one piece. But on the question of race, look, first of all, I think when people look at the map and it's like a sea of red and a couple of blue spots on the sides, it freaks you out. You're like, oh my God, there's so many people who are red. The reality is that most of that is land. Land does not vote. And really, it's really important to understand that the idea that sort of it's all urban or all, suburban, a lot of it is just land, right? It's not actually, a mass amount of people. But that being said, growing up in Wisconsin, growing up in a state that's 91% white and the birthplace of the progressive movement in America, understanding our history, the progressive movement was birthed out of farm workers and factory workers who came together because corporate interests were running roughshod over the state and harming both of them. And that's a really powerful lesson for all of us who want a country where people truly are free, where people can truly thrive and not just survive. And so, it requires us on the left not to just sort of be reactionary, not to just hate our oppressors out of hate, but to actually realize that if white supremacy is a noose around the neck of communities of color, then it has been a knife in the back of white communities in this country, right? It's why folks are struggling the way they are, particularly with the opioid crisis, particularly now with the pandemic. And so, it requires us to have those conversations, but we aren't going to, the reality is that social media and the fact that now people can create echo chambers where they are completely insulated from anybody of a differing opinion, much less a different background, is truly problematic. So if you want to know how does the Democratic Party make that shift, right? It really is. We have to invest in the same kind of long-term organizing for power in those rural communities as we do right now in urban communities and communities of color, right? We have to do it in an explicitly anti-racist way, but we still have to do it. And then, you know, just to the question of how do we become a social democracy? I mean, here's the thing, and Professor Manza has said this as well. The majority of the policies of leftists and progressives are the most popular policies in the country. In the Democratic primary, even when that primary went for Joe Biden, right? When voters were asked, Democratic voters were asked, would you like the country to move to a single payer healthcare system? Overwhelmingly, in every single primary that asked that question, the answer was yes, right? The vast majority of people in this country support raising the minimum wage to a minimum of $15 an hour, but you now have growing support to see it over $20 an hour, like it is in most European countries, right? You know, we dealing with climate change is another one where there is mass support to do something about the climate crisis, very little political will. So I think, you know, the US left, our goal here was about changing the conditions in the playing field that we are operating under, right? We understood that Biden is a better opponent for us than Trump was. And so now we are like in the sort of mode of saying, okay, now we've got to get to work here on some of these things that we have disagreements about. And I think, look, we won't, you know, in the next 4 years, are we going to see a single payer healthcare system in the United States? I don't think so. But if we win the Senate, if we win Georgia, I think we will see a public option in the United States, which I fought for in 2008, which got dismissed right away. And to me, that is power, right? That is growth. That is a demonstration that the left's ideas are salient, and if we're willing to stick with them and continue to push them, that we can win them.
Okay. Now, look, I'm really going to try and squeeze in at least one other question, perhaps two. So the questioner here, John Newman, a graduate of the University of London, asks a simple question: what lessons should the British Labour Party draw from the US election? And I think that's quite a big question. Let me just put a spin on it for you and direct it to Jeff Manza. I mean, you spoke about the fact that white men, especially white working class men, had moved towards the Republicans. Something parallel to that happened in the British general election, and it's ascribed to various things. But one of the things it's ascribed to is the lack of centrism on the part of the Labor candidate. And yet Joe Biden was a centrist candidate. So could you address the questioner's question perhaps with that in mind?
Yeah, I mean, I think I am 100% in agreement with everything Jennifer just said about Biden and his centrism. But I also would want to point out that the Democratic Party platforms have been getting more progressive at every turn. Hillary Clinton was way more progressive in 2016 than she was in 2008. Joe Biden's platform is more progressive. Like there is so there is a way in which Joe Biden is less of a centrist now than he was in 1994 or earlier. So that's point number one. And I think, while it is certainly true that, you know, he certainly does not embody progressive left tradition in any meaningful way. He's been a lifelong politician who was planning to run for president at age 29, according to his biography. So you know, I think the lessons for the Labour Party in Britain is, you know, one complication is a two-party system means there's nowhere for disaffected voters to go. You have, you know, a political space that's slightly more complicated, and it may be the case that one of the things that has been propping up the Democratic Party in recent years are those college-educated voters who may be voting for the liberal Democrats. And this is really more of a question for Robin. But, you know, in the American space, if you decide you are appalled and alienated from, you know, the Republican agenda, your only meaningful choice, if you care to, you know, have an impact on elections, is to vote for the other party. So, you know, that's an issue. I mean, I think that, you know, more generally, it's not that the kind of social democratic policy agenda is unpopular per se, but the reputation of it has declined across, we can see this across Europe, and even in the US, where government itself has become a source of opposition. And I think somehow we need to help spread the message or help people understand that when we talk about redistributive programs that try to benefit everybody and try to secure a decent standard of living for everyone, that the government plays a role, but it isn't the kind of thing that I think a lot of people perceive it to be. And I think that's the challenge I think the Labour Party has in the UK, the Democratic Party has in the US, social democratic parties across the world have in restoring confidence in the idea of government administration of these programs. I think it's particularly severe in the US and I sense in the UK as well.
Thank you. So I think this will have to be the last question, if I can address it to you, Jennifer. So it's from Yasmin in London, and she refers to the distinction you made at points between establishment Democrats and the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, and she'd like to know how you see the relationship between those things developing over the next 4 years, and also how the movement in general harnesses the enthusiasm that has emerged behind the progressives.
That's such a great question. I just want to shout out, somebody in the chat talked about US imperialism and whether Biden would be likely to start more wars. And I just want to say we are definitely concerned about US foreign policy, drone policy in particular, and are looking at that as something we have to watch out for under a Biden administration. So I just want to say I hear that. On to the question about sort of the direction of the party and where it's heading. I mean, look, I would encourage everybody to, read the article that AOC just dropped, where she talks about her offering to help Democrats with their digital programs, with their voter outreach programs, and how all but, I think 5 of the House Democrats that were up for election accepted her help. I really truly believe, I mean, now especially, but because of COVID, but even before COVID, that the Democrats were sort of running on a very old time model and needed to sort of update their modeling and like get comfortable with the changing demographics in their base. But I think that is going to be even more clear after this election, because you're going to have a lot of people who participated, some for the first time and some who had to be drugged back because of how bad Trump is, but really just did not want to have to vote for another Democrat. And it was really challenging for them to do so, who are going to put a ton of their efforts into both transforming Congress by challenging and primarying more centrist Democrats that don't fully represent the values of their communities or their states. I think we're going to see more people who live in majority people of color districts that have white congressional representation, challenging those folks from the left, right? As leftists of color like AOC. And I think that is a good thing because certainly we actually need more leftists of color in power because oftentimes what has sort of been the sort of linchpin for neoliberal policy has come through neoliberals of color, folks like President Obama or Susan Rice. And so for us, I think we need an AOC, a Jamal Bowman, a Cori Bush, who's a Black Lives Matter activist and will now be the first Black Congresswoman from Missouri. We really need that type of energy. So I think you're going to see more struggles. I do think because of the congressional losses, it may actually be an opportunity for the left here, because Nancy Pelosi will need to carry more of the Democratic caucus in order to move policy forward. And progressives will effectively have, if not the largest caucus within the Democratic Party, larger than the Black caucus, larger than the Latinx caucus, for example, or the Hispanic caucus, for example. Because progressives will have one of the largest caucuses, we could see progressives playing a much more Tea Party-like, game inside the halls of Congress, where sort of in this, previous administration, they had been really relegated to the bold ideas, right? To sort of putting out messaging bills that were signaling the direction we wanted to head, but not really having a lot of power to move those things forward. I think we'll see that there will be more power to at least block or amend traditional Democratic policies. And I think if we are able to win on some of those things, it will inspire more and more people to move forward. Ultimately, let me just say this though, which is, I want the Democratic Party to just represent the values of its base. As Professor Manza said, the platform has become increasingly more progressive. Many of the things that we're struggling and fighting for are against Democrats are actually in the platform, right? And so instead of seeing us as activists, as a thorn in their side, or as outside of the party or outside of their interests, I think one thing Democrats could learn from Trump is that your base and the people who are in the streets defending your ideals are actually your friends. Like, those are actually the people you should be governing with. So I'm hoping that's what emerges post-election. I'm a little nervous about what I've seen so far, but we're going to keep working on it.
Listen, thank you both very much. I mean, we've heard a range of interesting comments about the election from Jennifer Epps-Addison. I think we heard at the beginning the argument that Trumpism was really rooted in longer-term processes connected to neoliberalism. And she emphasised the importance of a strategy of organisation, and especially the organisational work of the left, and most especially of the black left, which she argued had brought about the outcome which we see now, and that creates a moment to address some of these root problems. And we heard from Jeff Manza that Trumpism was rooted in the solution to a dilemma of electoral conservatism. I think we're used to hearing about the dilemma of electoral socialism, but here we heard about the dilemma of electoral conservatism. But that in spite of that, the two inequalities that he referred to have been shifting with uneven gains in different respects. But at the end of the day, he was able to characterise a situation as creeping towards social democracy. So I think we've heard from our speakers something that is elements of optimism at the same time as many points of caution. And I'd just like to end by, on behalf of all of us here, thanking you both very much indeed for sharing your insights with us today. Thank you very much.
Thank you.